If you are a greater Bostonian, you live in one of the most interesting cities in the world, filled with some of the most interesting people.
A person of interest could be anyone. The person need not be among the rich and famous, although being rich and famous does not exclude someone from this title. A person of interest is someone, anyone, with an interesting story.
In each episode, we will interview a person whose life has had its dramas. It could be you. You are probably an interesting person. You have undoubtedly had a life filled with dramatic moments, both big and small.
If you would like us to interview you, please contact us. If not, please listen to your neighbors, friends, and community members that we interview and be inspired by the wonders of their life stories. And now, for our episode.
Holly Ryan looked like a male child. She did not feel like one, however. She felt different. She felt like she did not belong anywhere and was not able to pinpoint the reason for her discomfort. It was a long, hard journey for her to find her rightful place, that of a transgender woman, and embrace happiness as a result of knowing who she really is. Now she works hard to help other people in the LGBTQ+ community. She has been instrumental in passing statewide legislation and currently works in Mayor Fuller's office as an advocate for the LGBTQ+ community in Newton.
Welcome, Holly. Thank you so much for coming today. Let's start with your early life. What was your family like, and your mother and your father?
First, I'd like to say thank you for having me. I came from an Irish Catholic family. I was actually adopted as well as my sister. My grandmother lived with us. She had her typical, the back room with her picture of John F. Kennedy and the crucifix beside it. My father was a union telephone worker, and my mother was mostly stay at home.
When did you begin to kind of feel that you were different?
I believe it was around 7 years old when I really knew that something wasn't right. I didn't like the boy clothes I was wearing, and I would more like to look at the things in my grandmother's room and my mother's room, and I didn't really feel right with the other boys playing sports. I didn't know what was wrong. I just knew something was different. I believe when I was around 9 or 10 years old, some of the kids found out I was adopted. They kind of used it like as a taunt, and I said, "Oh, that's what's wrong with me."
Did you feel bullied?
No, I wasn't bullied. These were the kids I hang out with, but I think what they were doing was they were seeing something was different with me. They kind of clung on that, the adoption thing. They weren't adopted, I was, even though everything else looked the same. You know, we were from a working class part of Newton. It was the Veterans Project. All the fathers a lot of them were union people, but I still couldn't pinpoint it.
Did the fact that you were adopted console you?
Yeah, later on in life, when I started to really have some mental fights in my head about my gender identity and everything else that was going on, I used it in more of a negative way. And when I would talk to professionals, I would say, and then I turned it into an abandonment issue. Oh, my real parents didn't want me, and they dumped me, and they left me, and that's why I'm so angry, and which later turned into alcoholism. And that was always my excuse. I finally identified, even though I didn't like what I was seeing, that I was transgender. Actually, when I was growing up, and even when I was probably a young adult or late teens, we didn't have a word for it. They were the slang words, which were terrible, which we don't let people use today, like transvestite and he, she's, and to us that's like the N-word to the African American community. That's when we finally came up with the umbrella term transgender.
You said you were angry, so did you go through a period of time when you got very angry that you weren't identifying with the role of people? As they looked at you, that's what they thought you were?
Probably late about the junior year in high school, I totally knew who I was. I was playing sports. I was a great hockey player. I did a lot of things that would, to protect my masculinity, so to speak, and so you wouldn't find out what I knew. So I had to be the toughest and craziest person in the room. I had to play hockey, which was a fighting sport. I had all these defenses up because I didn't like what I was feeling. I didn't want to be transgender. And then that's when I started drinking. You know, I started drinking in high school. Eventually I thought that would make the feelings go away, but of course they didn't. I haven't had a drink or a substance in 26 years. That was also part of, when I did get sober, was part of finally confronting who I was and being able to transition and go forward with the person who I really am.
Or how did it happen that you resolved and feel better about who you were and accept who you were?
There really wasn't anybody around. The way I comforted myself was I went to the gay bars in Boston, and I hooked up with, at the time we called drag queens. That was the only people I could talk to about it. Drag queens, female impersonators, performers are usually gay men. That it's just a thing they do. They perform or dress up that way for parties or whatever. But then they go home and take the clothes off. And I remember one of my friends said to me once, because I didn't want to take the clothes off, said, "You're not like us," you know, and it wasn't in a bad way. They were trying to help me because I was angry with everybody. I was probably depressed. But it showed, you know, there was always something more wrong. Finally, they said to me, "Why don't you go check out this club? Because I think this is who you are." It was a really good friend of mine that said that. And it was the Tiffany Club in New England at the time was in Wayland. It was the oldest, probably the second, I think it's the second oldest transgender club in the country. And like now they're 45 years old. And yeah, that's where people were. It was mostly a lot of professional people, or what we call cross-dressers, where they do take the clothes off at night and go back to their police jobs or bank executive jobs or whatever. And at this time I was only seeing the male to female part of the community. But I did feel comfortable there. I did feel more comfortable. And then I remember there was these girls that hung around in the basement. And there was almost like a little barrier between them and the girls upstairs. And the girls who were in the basement were girls that worked their full-time transition. I gravitated towards them. That's really where I first started to get help and realized that there were other people like me.
So the girls in the basement had started out as men and they were transitioning to women at this point. Did they have the drugs and hormones and everything?
Yeah, we had that. But there were only a few surgeons. There was one in Canada. There were a couple here on the western part of the country. And this house that I'm talking about, Tiffany Club, Wayland, was actually originally started for girls that were transitioning. They had rooms upstairs, small rooms that they lived in. They would go off to the doctor. They'd come back after their surgery. The other girls would take care of them because we were totally pretty much alone, except for the few surgeons that would treat us and a few psychiatrists that would get prescribed the hormones. When they got better, most of them went to the West Coast because in those days you totally started a new life and you went all the way to the other side of the country. You basically left your family. Most people weren't accepted anyway, but you would go there so you could start a new life as female.
So at the time that you started your transition, you were in a traditional family. Can you tell us a little bit about your family at that time?
I wouldn't tell them. There's no way that I was going to come out to them. I remember when I was 15, I had really long hair. my waist. I actually ended up getting thrown off the hockey team because I wouldn't cut it. At that point, I was having trouble with drugs and alcohol, and I was still in the house, and my father came into me, and I was like 15 years old, and he called me a faggot. I really didn't, that's not what I was, and I knew there was something wrong, but it seemed he knew more than I knew about myself. He was so mad at me for the long hair and the music I listened to, and little did he know, he was close, but that's not what I was. And later on in life, I came back to the family home to take care of him when he was terminally ill. And we had to have a meeting with my sister and everybody before, because I was the one that was single at the time. You know, I was no longer married, and I could close up my apartment. But we had such a terrible relationship. It was awful. We'd fist fight. It was terrible. So we had to sit down, and I said, family's family, and I'm willing to take care of you, but I'm not going to fight with you every day. You know, I'm not coming back to this. And he said, I'm too old to worry about how you live your life today. He said, I want you to come back. I said, you want me to come back to take care of you, or do you want me to come back to take care of you and because you want me to be back? Because we can probably, you know, find the money to have somebody else do it. And he said, no, I want you there. So what was 6 months turned into 7 years.
And how did your mother relate to you?
She, as mothers seem to always know, she knew all along, and I told her way before I told him. I was out of the house at the time, but she died before him, like 8 years before him, and she was cool with it. She knew all along. She told me she thought I was gay too, but she didn't care. Didn't bat an eyelash. Still told me she loved me and all that.
You did get married at one point, right?
I was married twice.
Oh, you were married twice?
I was married when I was 20, and lasted a few years. We didn't have children or anything, and mostly because my alcoholism was so bad at the time. And the other thing that we do, and even gay men do, is we get married to think that this is going to go away. Yeah, it's another mechanism I don't want to be who I am, so if I get married, then it'll all go away. So that marriage lasted a few years, but it was because of my alcoholism. You know, I still was sneaking downtown and going to the gay bars, and later on I was married again, and that's where the other parent was the mother of my daughter, Kristen. That lasted for a while, but she was also an alcoholic and a drug addict. That's probably the only thing we had in common. I had gotten sober after my daughter was born for her. She couldn't get sober, and I ended up pretty much raising my daughter by myself. And I was still hiding who I was, but it was getting harder and harder.
And what about your son? Is he older or younger than your daughter?
My daughter's 30, my son's 23. And that's another relationship, but I was never married.
So they're two different mothers here?
Yes, two different mothers.
When you met the first one and you were 20, did you feel you were in love?
I think it was more convenience. It was big in the gay community, too. It was a way to hide who you were. And then you went off and did your thing. And it was more common than not. The other person ends up getting hurt at some point, and it's a good thing today that people don't have to do that.
Before we started, you told a wonderful story about your daughter.
Well, my daughter, when I think it was 5th or 6th grade, when she was over the house, said, I want to live with you. I said, there's going to be some problems. I said, I'd love to have you live with me. I had the house in Newton. I lived alone. And I said, but, this is what could possibly happen. You could be bullied in school, not because of you, but because of me. And other than that, it's fine. Newton's a great place, great school. And she said, no, I can take it. I want to do this. That's what happened. Eventually, we had to go to court because the mother and her mother, my daughter's grandmother decided they were going to try and take her back. At the time, her other parent was a full-blown heroin addict. They thought just because I was transgender that they were going to, and I had transitioned and everything, that they're just going to waltz in and that's going to matter. And actually it was still going on. You could have a parent that couldn't even provide, that was sitting at the kitchen table doing drugs with their friends, and they would still give it to that parent because transgender was such an awful thing, and it wasn't. My job at the time was purchasing and food service director for a large human service company. I looked at the judge and it looked like my grandmother, and I said, "Oh, I'm in trouble now." And no, she said, "No." Looked at everything and said, "Holly will provide the best home." And I had a drug and alcohol-free home. It turned out I was the first openly transgender person in the Commonwealth to be granted custody of one of their children.
Your daughter, a very brave person, and that when you warned her that, people may drop her, you said, "Oh, if they drop me, they drop me. They're not my friends if they don't accept you." Were there any other? What about your son? Was he equally as brave?
It wasn't necessarily him being brave, it didn't matter anymore. And it turned out, she finally said to me one day, she said, "You were being overly dramatic about that stuff. You were too hard on yourself." Nobody bats an eyelash in this city. I guess we're lucky where we live, too, but it was never a problem. And then later on, when we were fighting for our rights and everything, I realized how many allies we actually have. In middle school, she was getting bullied by one kid. And it was a kid she went to elementary school with, too. And finally, I had to call. I was, at that point, a pretty big activist and involved, so I called a friend at the police station, and I got the community service officer who was assigned to the middle school to come over and talk to my daughter and to me. They right away contact the other parents, and they go to the house, and yeah, it did stop. But the funny thing is they actually became friends and seniors in high school, and then he wrote a letter to her when he was a freshman in college, and he had come out as gay. So once again, it's a very common defense mechanism. I mean, you see it in politics with the people that vote against all LGBTQ legislation, and eventually they come out as gay. And a lot of times we have a saying that people that scream the F word the loudest are the deepest in the closet, and it turns out to be more so than not.
Once you transitioned, did you have the same group of friends before and after? Did some friends drop you?
I had my so-called best friend at the time is the only one that left. It was over religion. He was a big practicing Catholic. I mean, I basically was a practicing Catholic too, but he used to hang around with the priests. A couple of friends I had who were priests too, the same friends, and so he couldn't handle it. My sister just said, "Oh, thank God you find out that's why you were so angry." I always carried this don't get too close persona. When I came out and said I'm going to transition, some people said we already knew, figured it out. By the time I had actually came out, I had already had all the electrolysis done on my face, and my hair was at a certain length, and I was wearing it more of a female style, and used to tie it back to think I was getting away with it. As I said, most people stayed. Most people were relieved to find out that I guess I had some very smart people around me, because they always saw the edge I had on. And later on I identified it more as rage and not anger. I was so mad I wasn't living the life I was supposed to be living, and I wasn't being my true self. When I did come out, it was more of a relief to everybody, and then I was able to look people in the eye, and as I like to say, I wouldn't have to cross to the other side of the street. And that's when I was able to start helping a lot of people, because I had no more fear about being found out. And that's when I became a full-blown activist with the transgender community.
Today, you have none of that rage?
No.
What is your nuclear family like today?
It's actually very good, and I hate to use the word normal, but if you looked at it, we're just like everybody else. I have a great relationship with my son's other parent. She's engaged now to be married. She spends winters in Florida. She has a key to my house. I have a key to her house in Waltham, where she lives when she's here. Thanksgiving, Christmas, I do Christmas at my house, Christmas Eve, like we always did in that family house.
Mhm.
My sister and brother-in-law come up from Virginia. My kids come over with boyfriends or girlfriends or whoever they're with at the time. Very nurturing. If somebody gets in trouble, we're all there.
When you changed your identity, did you run into any problems like at work or anyplace else?
So yeah, I was
Becoming a
2
woman?
years on the job. I actually ended up just retiring from that job October. I was 24 years on that job, and I transitioned on that job 2 years in. So actually, 22 years I was after transition, and I got 3 promotions after I transitioned. I was a lead manager in the company. I did all the negotiations. So it was scary for everybody, even though it was a human service company that took care of people in need. The only thing that matters was my CEO at the time, who was also a recovering alcoholic, because he hired a lot of people that were in recovery. That's why I went to work there, because at the time I was helping a lot of people to get sober or get off of drugs anyway. I just did that because I did that. But he looked at what else I had done in my life and said, I need you to build a new department for me, which was we're a multi-unit all over the Commonwealth of Mass. But he stood up. I went to him and said, I got to do this. You know, you're waiting to get fired, because in those days they could fire you right on the spot for transitioning. We had no protections in employment or housing or credit or public education. Could be thrown out right away, no questions asked, and it was legal. And so I like to say, you were putting everything up on the table when you did something, came out to your boss or your family, because you could possibly lose everything in your life. He said, oh, and he tried to wrap his head around it. You know, he was I like to call him Joe Six-Pack type of guy, but he didn't drink anymore. But he was another Irish Catholic guy, Peter Donovan his name was. It was pretty well known in Waltham. We had the big management meeting the next day, and he said, oh, I got it. I know how I can describe this. So he said, I'm going to tell everybody tomorrow at the meeting. And I can't say no, because he's going to let me keep working there. And they're going to, I'm going to transition my gender there in front of everybody. And at the time I was in management, and people had to listen to me. So he walked in the next day of the management meeting. He stood up and said, this is what's going to happen. Holly's going to transition. It's going to take a little while. Holly will be starting to wear women's clothes. I back her 100%. And he said, her. And he said, I back her 100%. And he said, I relate this to being an alcoholic. When things were getting bad and all the secrets I had to keep, he said. And he said, secrets are terrible. Secrets will always bring you down. And that was that. I had my core of people that came right to me afterwards and said, we're with you. It was all women. And said, we're with you and we support you 100%. And they did right along through the transition, and even till the day I left. There are a few of us still there that started years ago. The guys running the halfway houses, they couldn't handle it. The CEOs told them to keep their mouths shut, and it's none of their business, and this is the way it is, because he says this is the way it is. It wasn't easy.
How did these men relate to you? But were they ever openly insulting, or did they just give you dirty look?
Well, yeah, the dirty looks, and we were friends before and on the workplace, and we weren't anymore. I found a couple of little signs or notes around. But the thing was, I overwhelmingly had a majority of people that were with me, so that kept me going. I retired when I wanted to retire, when I was retirement age.
It's coming out, now I'm free. Now I don't have to pretend anymore.
When I came out and there were no more secrets, the freedom was incredible. Well, now I can help a lot of people. Which eventually turned into passing laws, but I was the one that could stand there and look people in the eye that were yelling hate speech at me. And
the suicide rate among gay and transgender,
it's very, very high.
So that means these kids need really a lot of support.
Right, and we give it to them here in Newton.
How do people outside the community support them?
Children's Hospital is big on, one of the leaders, and always has been, on if you identify as transgender, you need to make the transition way earlier than I did, like basically puberty. So you can live a better life, because this is when all your puberty is when everything's changing. In schools now, you have your gay straight alliances. This is where kids can be with peers, and with straight kids too that support them. In our case in Newton, if you identify as trans, even in elementary school, usually it works as a parent comes and says to the school administration, so usually the principal and the teacher, that we want our child to transition. And then Health and Human Services is notified, all our school nurses are trained. They're the first frontline people on this. We have trainings for other parents in the school.
Would you say today, after all you've gone through, that you're happy and well-adjusted?
If you got my sister in here, and she'd say there's this line on this one day when Holly came out that I changed totally. I couldn't help another person. I couldn't help myself. I was always weaving, ducking, and bobbing for you not to find out who I was. When I came out, it was, okay, I'm doing this. I have to do this to live. Because I had been sober for 11 years and picked up a drink again for a year and a half, and it caused me all kinds of problems. It was because I couldn't come out. I didn't come out. When I could look you in the eye, then the whole world opened up to me. Then I could be a leader to take care of the rest of our community. And then I was better with my family. I was better with my children. My sister used to say, you never, ever smiled. Now I smile all the time, and I did right after that, and I could laugh. I never laughed. What I do today, I'm the LGBTQ plus liaison for the mayor of Newton. I was past chair of Mass Trans Political Coalition, where we introduced the first law in 2004 to protect transgender people in housing credit, employment, and public education. And then later on, we passed the public accommodations part of it. Everybody else free to go everywhere in the Commonwealth and eat in any restaurant I want to, and go into any movie theater or hardware store or a hospital or ride the T. And this is because I am able to stand there, hold my head high today. Congress.
Well, Holly, I really think this has been a terrific conversation, and I thank you so much for being so very, very honest during it. And I thank you so much for coming and are participating in Serendipity Person of Interest.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Holly. You have been listening to Serendipity's Person of Interest, produced and directed by Tonette Terhar and Barbara John. If you have an interesting story and would like to participate in this podcast or have any helpful suggestion, email us at barbaraj.massed@gmail.com. barbaraj.massed@gmail.com. We would very much like to thank our guests and the staff at New TV, who are always more than helpful. So until our next episode, we will say goodbye. Thank you for listening.